Welcome back to Proxammer, everybody. And today we're going to be looking at the Craftworld Eldar nerfs and buffs in Arks of Omen, which are currently out. I've gotten to take a look at the balanced data slate, and man, am I disappointed. I did not think that Eldar were going to get quite as ignored as they were. And even though we did get a few buffs as well, it just doesn't seem right. There was something about that balanced data slate that just rubbed me really the wrong way. And I think what it was the fact that GW in no way tried to actually address the real problems of the codex, and instead just put a couple of, honestly, in my opinion, meaningless buffs on a couple of units. So let's go ahead and look into it. And I'm going to try to not make this video super negative because, I'm not really that kind of person overall. And I've been playing Eldar for 20 years, and honestly, we've had it worse. So I'm going to keep that to a minimum, but I am going to address what I think GW messed up on, and basically what happened, what the changes were, the buffs and the nerfs, the good and the bad. So quick overview of what we're going to be talking about in this video. We're going to be looking at the rules and points changes to the various units in the Craftworld Eldar Codex. We're going to be doing an analysis of the changes and the effects it will have on the faction. And lastly, we're going to be trying to answer the question, has GW fixed the issue of internal balance within the Codex or somehow made it worse? So on the rules front, all previous rules nerfs remain basically the same, except that Fire and Fade is no longer limited to once per game, which is pretty good. When I found this out, I was actually pretty happy about it. But this does seemingly bring an element of uninteractiveness back to the faction. And this is something that GW claimed they did not want in the Craftworld Eldar Codex. They claimed that the Craftworld Eldar were just far too uninteractive to basically play against. And that's why they limited Fire and Fade. So I'm a little bit confused as to why they brought it back here. To be honest with you, I can understand for a faction like Harlequins, which they also nerfed, by reducing their survivability, why they would understandably get Fire and Fade back in a way. But I have to admit, it kind of goes against their previous philosophy with the Craftworld Eldar. So when I saw this, I was a little bit confused, but, I love Fire and Fade. I'm going to take it, Using it every turn is something that's great. I think that's a pretty good thing overall for the strength of the faction. But it did leave me a little bit confused as to what their intentions were. Looking at the points, buffs, and nerfs, Farseers, both Skyrunners and on foot, got increased by 10 points per model, but guess what? Eldrad did not. Eldrad remains the king. Obviously, he was able to mind war some of the GW staff into not nerfing him and increasing his points by 10. Eldrad is still the undisputed champion of psychic powers for the Eldar. And now, probably even more so, he's looking to be an excellent choice for any Webway player that wants to write up their list. With a Psyker-heavy focus. Warlocks and Warlock Skyrunners increased by 5 points, except guess what? For some weird reason, JW decided we're going to keep single Warlock Skyrunners the exact same cost. So even though they increased the Foot Warlock Conclave, the Single Foot Warlock, and the Skyrunner Conclave, they didn't increase the Warlock Skyrunner on Jetbike as a character. So that's pretty cool. That's how I ran Warlocks anyway, so nothing much changed there most of the time. I did, unfortunately, run a lot of Foot Councils and a couple of Battle Psyker type lists and stuff like that, and unfortunately, that is going to cost a lot more points. And this next change really threw me for a loop. And it was one of those changes where I really believed that GW was coming from this from a very weird perspective. And that is that D-Sites got increased by 5 points. So this was one of those nerfs that honestly I thought, wow, this is honestly something that I would suspect a new player going against D-Sites for the first time would complain about, right? This is one of those nerfs where, a person playing Space Marines for the first or second time goes against D-Sites, loses a unit of Terminators or loses a unit of, tactical Marines with it, and just starts complaining about it, right? This seemed like a really casual nerf, and I don't say that lightly. Because to be honest with you, D sites were often considered one of the lesser options for the Craftworld Eldar Wraithguard. And I have to say, even though they were present in a couple of tournament lists, I never really found that there was a problem with them. In fact, in those tournament lists, they seemed like just a very niche pick that was chosen because they happened to blend in to what that list was trying to accomplish. And that's it. Even in those lists, I think the players would have admitted that, yeah, the D sites were probably a little bit expensive, but I needed something like this in my list that could wipe out units very easily, even if they didn't trade up. Which most of the time they wouldn't do anyway. So very disappointed with that D site nerf. Didn't make a lot of sense. Again, seemed like a very casual, noobish kind of nerf, something that a noob would complain about. So that was a little bit odd to me. Moving on, though, we got a buff to Shroud Runners. Shroud Runners got reduced by 5 points a model, which, hey, I love Shroud Runners. Honestly, when I saw this, I was like, oh, okay, cool. My Shroud Runners are cheaper. They're more cost-effective, which is great. However, honestly, I looked at that and I was very bewildered by it. And I actually don't agree with this, because I think Shroud Runners were great before. And I don't think they really needed a cost reduction. I have to admit, Shroud Runners were already a very good unit for what they were, and they were already priced pretty well, I think. Now, getting a price reduction actually hurts the internal balance of the codex, in my opinion. It essentially makes Wind Riders with scatter lasers completely obsolete. You probably won't ever take those if you're running Wind Riders, which is unfortunate. Again, this is something where the Eldar Codex has a lot of issues, right, is with internal balance. And the buff to Shroud Runners has, in a very large way, hurt Wind Riders with scatter lasers. So, not a great thing, I don't think. Honestly, looking at this buff, it was great for Shroud Runners, obviously, but not so great for other units in the Codex. Swooping Hawks, now this is the one everybody's talking about. Swooping Hawks are up by 5 points per model, which, to be honest with you, I kind of understand, because Swooping Hawks are a unit that were pretty much featured in every competitive Eldar list, because they're just so good, right? They do good on objectives. They do good on, being able to negate enemy secondary actions and stuff like that. They're just a very good unit overall. But, when players spam them as much as they do, GW tends to notice that across tournament lines. So if they see, 5 or 6 tournament lists that Eldar are running, all of them have Swooping Hawks, and a couple of them are even getting spammed, they're probably going to look at that unit and want to nerf it. Now, do I really think that Swooping Hawks are worth 25 points a model? Yeah, I do, for the utility that they bring to the battlefield and their objective abilities. I don't think they're worth their points in damage anymore. I think their damage was already kind of low, to be honest with you guys. I know that a lot of people, would say things like, oh, well, they're great because you can debuff an enemy unit and just, kind of force them to roll ones. And, that's fantastic and all. I think they did decent damage, to be honest. I mean, even for their 20-point cost. But you also had units like Shroud Runners, right, which basically did comparable damage and did some other stuff too that Swooping Hawks maybe couldn't do. So I'm not arguing that Swooping Hawks were bad at all. I just think their damage now for the points is probably not as great. So Swooping Hawks getting that nerf, you probably will see them a little bit less. And Dark Reapers also got reduced by 15 points, not per model, but per unit. So they're 135 points for the unit now. Honestly, this is one of those fixes that I just kind of think is funny, because it doesn't really do anything, right? If you were running Dark Reapers before, you were not running them for them to be good. You were running them because they were awesome and they looked awesome. And they were really cool, obviously models, right? You weren't necessarily running them because they were good. So is this enough to make Dark Reapers good? Absolutely not. I think they're still probably a C or D tier unit in the Eldar Codex. I don't think any competitive list will ever run them. And honestly, I think even a lot of semi-competitive lists won't run them. I do see them working in more casual lists a lot better because of Fire and Fade, not because of their points reduction. And I truly think because Space Marines, which is their primary target, got point reductions across the board, Dark Reapers getting a point reduction really kind of just evens out more and doesn't really matter too much. It is a small buff. I'm not going to ding it. I'll take it, but it's just like, it's like kind of like a Band-Aid for something that was much more needed. I think they either needed to be reduced by more points or they needed a complete and utter rework. And I did a video on this a while back. Honestly, I think Dark Reapers needed a rework to be good. I don't think they should have gotten a points reduction. I think they should have instead gotten a rework to be better. So that's where Dark Reapers stand. Again, do I like Dark Reapers? Yes, I have a couple of units of them. Do I use them or do I intend to use them in any kind of competitive format? Probably not. They're still pretty bad. But for those of you who are already running Dark Reapers in your list, you're not going to, bat your eyes at this. This is going to be a pretty okay buff. You're going to be pretty okay with this. The last change is that the Webway gate is now 100 points up from 80 points. So this is one of those things that honestly a lot of players didn't really care about and didn't think about. But I didn't like it. I looked at this and I thought to myself, wow, okay, so I know strategic reserves are free now, but one of the abilities that the Webway gate has been completely nerfed and unusable now, which is, units in reserve half their CP cost. And considering that deploying the Webway gate is a little bit difficult in certain scenarios, I don't actually think that the Webway gate is worth 100 points. I'm not sure why they did this. Yes, it's easier to put units in reserve, but the Webway gate already made it easier for units to be in reserve. I mean, you could have like 3 or 4 units in reserve in a Webway gate for one command point. So that just didn't really make a lot of sense. Now, I do see the Webway gate kind of being cool in like something like a Wraith Knight list where you could have Wraith Knights coming out of it. That's pretty awesome. But again, it just doesn't seem that great overall, right? And I may be wrong. There might be competitive lists that feature the Webway portal in the coming months and stuff like that. We'll just have to see. But I just don't think the nerf was necessary. I think the Webway portal was good, but it wasn't some fantastic OP or broken fortification before, and I don't think it'll be now, even if strategic reserves are all reduced to 0 command points. So let's go over an analysis of the changes and the effects it'll have on the faction. So the first thing that I think will change is that it's going to give certain units more protection, with Fire and Fade becoming unrestricted again. Shroud Runners are much cheaper and will be seeing more action in the coming months. Swooping Hawks won't be spammed as much. Farseers and Warlocks are still going to be prevalent, obviously, in lists. They're pretty required. But I do see Warlock Conclaves being played less. And lastly, Dark Reapers will remain unused. So, as far as Fire and Fade becoming unrestricted, Fire Prisms, Warwalkers, and various other units that don't have easy access to Battle Focus will have a much easier time staying alive while accruing value. So, I can honestly see people coming back to Fire Prisms a little bit. Fire and Fade is a very reliable way to get a Fire Prism in and out of cover using linked fire quite often every turn. And again, it does cost a lot of command points to do that, but it is a good way of getting some reliable anti-tank fire down the field that also ignores invul saves. So is it expensive? Yes, but it does a lot of damage and it's pretty worth it. And now you don't really have to invest so much in vectored engines. Warwalkers, on the other hand, I think are also going to be coming back. I think people are going to start including one unit in their army because of this ability. I think Warwalkers are very good with Fire and Fade. Either Bright Lancers or Scatter Lasers, for a relatively decent cost, can jump in and out of cover and just pop vehicles or pop infantry units at will. That's pretty awesome. I think Warwalkers are going to be making a little bit of a comeback themselves. And also, it just adds reliability to other units. Let's say you don't have the room for a battle focus role. You could use Fire and Fade instead. So that's pretty good. But having said that, even though it is a big buff for the Eldar again, it doesn't really match up with what GW was trying to do when they first set out to nerf Fire and Fade. And again, they're trying to reduce the uninteractiveness of the faction, but they're doing such a bad job at it. They're almost requiring us. It's weird. They're almost setting us up to be uninteractive. And that's a little bit strange to me. I've never really kind of understood that philosophy. And when you look at other games, like let's just take other games, for example. Let's say something like Hearthstone or League of Legends or, any of those MOBA or card games, right? When they come out with nerfs and buffs, they always explain the reasoning why, right? They're trying to fit an agenda. There's a card that's a problem, so they nerf it a little bit and they explain why they nerfed it, right? Or there's a card that's really underplayed and doesn't have much power to it. And they're able to use data from the game to be able to make an informed decision about what they're going to do with that card, right? And I don't know if you guys play those games, honestly, but it's easier for those companies to do stuff like that. And I don't know why it's not easy for GW to do this. GW honestly has less work to do in that front. They have less updates, and yet they still are unable to come up with simple explanations as to each reason that they give for their particular buffs and nerfs. So again, this is something that GW is very non-transparent about. And I think that should change because, I think GW really has no excuse. I think they have less work to do than other companies on this front, on the rules writing front and the game front, and yet they're not able to do it. So yeah, I'd like some explanations, obviously. I think Fire and Fade, yeah, it's a great buff. But why did you give us back Fire and Fade when you previously told us the exact opposite, that you were trying to limit the amount of uninteractiveness that Eldar have as a faction? So a little bit of contradictions there and something that I'd like to see addressed. The next thing is Shroud Runners are now much cheaper and we'll see a lot more action. So reducing a unit that was already S tier, in my opinion, makes this unit almost an auto-include for the good damage and utility they bring to the table. I think, honestly, most competitive lists will have at least one unit of Shroud Runners in it, and some of them might have more, honestly. I know they have a big base size, but in most cases, you can at least be able to fit a unit of 3 in there. And honestly, I can tell you, it just depends on the tournament. If the tournaments have heavier terrain, you're going to see Shroud Runners more. If they don't have much terrain, you're probably not going to see as many Shroud Runners. But even so, you might see, several units of 3 of these. I could definitely see that being a thing. And also, again, with more fast attack slots open as well, I'm sure you will see more than a few units of these in pretty much a lot of lists because they're just so good for 30 points. Now, this is one of those units that, again, I didn't think needed a points buff. I really didn't think they needed it because they were already really good and they already seemed very well priced for what you got. And just from experience, I know Shroud Runners to me were one of the best units in my army. And they were a unit that I leaned on a lot in a lot of games. And you can even see this in a couple of my battle reports that I had on the channel. The Shroud Runners pretty much always acted as a very strong defensive unit. And, they're not so good for like Alpha Strike style lists, to be honest. They just don't have the direct punching power for that. But over the course of the game, they can accrue a lot of damage and they get a lot of value out of their scattered lasers and Ranger long rifles. People forget about that. But those Ranger long rifles are really good for picking off tougher things with Strands of Fate and stuff like that. So obviously with this points buff, I see Shroud Runners being used a lot more, and that will probably boost GW's Shroud Runner sales, I imagine. So Swooping Hawks also won't be spammed as much as they were before. So Swooping Hawks got a big points nerf due to the fact that players were running them in droves, and I saw several tournament lists myself with 2 squads of huge Swooping Hawks, 2 huge units of Swooping Hawks, basically just uninteractable, alive for the whole game, doing lots of damage for their points, and also being able to do things like disrupt enemy actions and stuff like that, just being super annoying. And while I do think that the uninteractive nature of Swooping Hawks made them a little bit annoying and edgy, I don't think, without corresponding buffs to other units, that they should have been nerfed. And again, I would have been fine with a 5-point, hike in points to Swooping Hawks if other units in the Codex were similarly buffed. And I'm not talking about Shroud Runners. I'm talking about units that aren't used. Things like Wraith units, right? Wraith Blades and Wraith Guard. I'm talking about things like Guardians, Storm Guardians, and Guardian Defenders. I think those units should have been buffed because, honestly, there's very little incentive now, if any incentive, to take things like Guardian Defenders or Storm Guardians because, guess what? You don't need troops. So going forward, you're probably going to see a lot less Swooping Hawks in lists. I think they're going to be used more as a utility unit for objectives and denial of Overwatch in actions rather than for damage. You're not going to see people running 20 of these. It's too much of a tax to pay, I think, in most lists. And when you combine that with the tax on things like Farseers and Warlocks, you're looking at easily over 200 points worth of points tax. And of course, I'm talking about if players are running like 3 units of Swooping Hawks and 3 Farseers and things like that, you're going to see a lot of tax from that. So I think people are going to be spamming these a lot less. Maybe you'll see a squad of 10, but again, that's a 50-point increase, and that's a lot of investment, right? So I think, honestly, I've been running Swooping Hawks for a long time as a 5-man unit for denial purposes and not so much for damage. So I can definitely see people running less of these and being okay with it, to be honest. Farseers and Warlocks obviously are still going to be prevalent, but I see Warlock Conclaves being played less. So obviously Farseers are still an auto-include. I mean, they could make them 150 points per model, which would be absolutely outrageous, obviously, but they could do that and they would still be good. And you would still see them in Eldar lists. But I do see this being a bit of a points tax to Webway specifically. And that's because Webway likes to run 3 Farseers, they like to run Warlock Conclaves and Councils and things like that. So I think people are going to lean more into Warlock Skyrunners as their cost did remain at 65 points. And the Skyrunner is a very good model anyway. I don't know why the single character foot Warlock got... To be honest with you guys, I don't know why any of the Warlocks got increased in points. Because to be quite fair and honest, Warlocks are kind of one of the problematic psychers in the Eldar Codex. When you're running them outside of Webway. I know within Webway, they're just very solid and very good, and they rarely have many problems because, you know, they get extra strands of fate because of the, you know, relic that they have, or warlord trait, that they have. You know, they have the Ghost Helm of Al-Shazir, which helps them, you know, have undeniable psychic powers, and they're just relatively more reliable. Everyone gets a +1, for example. And they're not, you know, they're also very good in Children of Prophecy lists. But in lists outside of Webway, they kind of struggle a little bit because they don't have the +1 to casting. They don't have anything like the Ghost Helm of Al-Shazir or extra strands of fate dice that are lying around for psychic tests. So if you're going to nerf anything, I hate to say it, but nerf Webway a little bit. Give them something. Don't take away from Warlocks in general, I think. So Warlock Conclaves are probably going to be too pricey now in general, and not as cost-effective as they once were. And I've made videos on how cost-effective and great these guys were against various targets. They traded up against a lot of different really powerful units like Tyranid Warriors when they were given the Singing Spears. And I thought that was absolutely amazing. A unit of Warlocks could take out a unit of Warriors pretty easily. And that's not going to really be the case for the cost anymore. Now, they might still be able to deal with Warriors because Warriors also did get a nerf. But I just don't see these guys as a general pick in most games because being increased by 5 points a model when you're running 5 models, again, is a big tax. And if you're running a lot of these, that can be a little bit steep to pay. And lastly, Dark Reapers will remain unused. So again, 15 points shaved off their cost is nowhere near enough to make them cost effective, even with the accompanying AOC Armor of Contempt removal. It's sad that they didn't get a rework, but it is expected. I expected a bigger points decrease, though. I'm going to be honest. I expected at least 25 points to be taken off them at the minimum. And then on top of that, I even expected a little bit of maybe even more, you know? Because I really don't see these guys as a great unit. And I think GW really doubled down on the fact that they think they made a great unit, you know? And they made a great model kit for it, and everything is good in the world because, you know, we're GW and we're always right. So again, don't think that was a good choice to not decrease their points by a significant amount, or just not even give them a rework or any kind of new cool abilities. So that's a shame. So overall, I think Dark Reapers are still going to not be played. I think there are still better targets for Fire and Fade as well. But at least they have the option now, and I don't think they will be too bad in more casual games when combined with the right far-flung traits. I do think in a Masterful Shots kind of list, they can be okay. I do think they can be decent in those lists, but honestly, they just struggle outside of that, and in most lists, they're going to have a really hard time. So, has GW fixed the issue of internal balance within the codex or somehow made it worse? And I believe GW actually made the internal balance worse with the nerfs. So Shroud Runners are now better than Wind Riders with scatter lasers in almost every way. Wraith units are still overpriced, and when you look at all the insane weapons and auto wound abilities out there, and you kind of start to think that Wraith Guard aren't really that durable anymore. And they're really not, especially when you take into account that a lot of the Space Marine factions are basically just getting free war gear now. So free plasma guns, free plasma cannons, missile launchers, last cannons, everything that can easily take out a Wraith Guard, they have access to for free. So kind of difficult for Wraith Guard right now, I have to admit. And then in one instance, Wraith Guard even got nerfed. The D-Sights got nerfed, which again, my opinion, big noob kind of nerf. You know, this is kind of, if you gave control of the nerfs to somebody who was new to 40K and had just fought against Eldar as Space Marines, that's what you would see. You would see nerfs to D-Sights. And honestly, I've been playing this game for a very long time, and I've had my fair share of games against, you know, newer players before I was kind of introduced to the current gaming group that I'm playing with. And let me tell you, those are exactly the kind of nerfs that they would come up with after a game against me. You know, they would complain about the units that honestly I thought were just completely, you know, mediocre or average at the time. And yeah, it really did feel like GW did that. Was honestly, the D-Sight nerf felt very noobish to me. Also, Warlocks and Farseers are pretty much still required for the army to operate at peak efficiency, which means we will have less point to invest in other outlier units. Which is unfortunate. Again, you know, you want to be able to take more units, but if they're increasing the cost of your mandatory units like Farseers and Warlocks, you're going to have less room to play around with other types of units that may not be super competitive or super, you know, quote unquote meta. And, you know, obviously that's not all of us. I know that, for example, for me, I don't always run the most meta, most edgy kind of Eldar lists out there. I try to have some fun with it as well. So, but in general, that's going to be the case. Troops also no longer being required, and now there is very little incentive to bring them other than the occasional ranger unit or two for screening purposes, which means that because we have less points in general to work with, people are going to be a lot less willing to bring things like Guardians, right? Because Guardians are not really needed anymore for their troops. And not only that, but none of our troop choices got a buff, and I can definitely see people just Xing troops altogether and reinvesting those points into more fast attack, again, into Swooping Hawks that are now more expensive, into Warlocks and Farseers that are also more expensive. So that's a real shame. I think we're going to be seeing a lot less troops in most Eldar armies now. So in conclusion, I think the changes were very disappointing and honestly don't make a lot of sense or match up with what MetaWatch told the community they aim to fix. And honestly, you know, I know a lot of people were happy about MetaWatch, that finally GW was talking about why they're making the changes and what they plan to do and stuff like that. But it really doesn't mean much if they say one thing and then they do the complete opposite, right? And to me, that's no better than what we were at before. And in some cases, I'd honestly rather prefer that nothing is said at all if they're not going to explain why they made the changes that they did, or if they're not going to actually stick to what they said in previous videos. So again, something that they said they were aiming to fix in the codexes was internal balance. Did they achieve this in the Craftworld Eldar Codex? No, they did not. And to be honest with you, looking at some of the other changes in the other books, honestly, I'm not a Tau player or a Orc player or any other Xeno factions player, but I can tell you by looking at some of the nerfs that I've seen so far on buffs on some of those factions that they did nothing to address the internal balance of the Codex. I mean, did they do anything to buff Kroot, for example, in the Tau Codex? Or Vespid? Probably not, right? I actually don't think either of those units actually got a buff. I may be wrong, but I don't think they did. And honestly, you know, if they're sitting there and they're just not buffing the units that are considered the worst in the Codex, they're not doing anything to fix the internal balance of the Codex, right? Doesn't matter kind of what other changes they're making. The internal balance of the Codex is going to remain bad because people still aren't going to choose those units. So MetaWatch said that they aim to fix the internal balance of the codexes. They have failed, and they have especially failed with Craftworld Eldar, in my opinion. Again, the internal balance of the codex is more or less the same, and dare I say, I think it's slightly worse, actually. And it's very lopsided with clearly better choices in each and every category, honestly. You look at our fast attack, when are you ever going to choose Wind Riders with scatter lasers again? Probably never, right? And that's not something you should have. There should be a good choice when you're looking at a category. It should be difficult choices to make in every single category. Or at least equally viable choices, right? There just shouldn't be a clear choice in every category. And if you look at every slot, and I can go through them right now, there's a clear choice in every category. For HQ, Farseers. For Elites, obviously you have things like Howling Banshees, Strike Scorpions, right, that are going to be on top. You're not going to be typically using Wraith Guard units in general because they're just not durable for the cost anymore. For fast attack, you're probably not going to use Wind Riders with scatter lasers. They're pretty much off the table. So, that's a real shame. You're not being able to use that unit because they just compare so badly to the other units. And for heavy support, you're not using a few units in heavy support as well. You're not using Vibro Cannons. You're not using Dark Reapers. And, again, those are units that are really cool and that I wish you could use. But unfortunately, they're so bad that if you pick them, you're basically putting yourself at a disadvantage in the game, which a lot of players don't want to do, even in a semi-competitive, kind of environment where you're just playing with friends, but you still want to win your games, right? And if you're doing that and you're putting yourself at a disadvantage like that and your opponent's not doing it, then, you're going to be out of luck, pretty much. You're going to be down a unit pretty much 100% of the time. So, in general, though, I do think that Eldar are still a solid faction. I know that seems like I complained a lot about the changes, and I am kind of disappointed with the changes, obviously. I do still think they're a solid faction, but the lack of internal balance is really concerning. So what do I see for the foreseeable future? Well, I see Ynnari taking a little bit of a nosedive. I know that seems like an odd thing to say, but because Flyers have to start in reserve now, their famous Alpha Strike list is not going to be prevalent anymore. Basically, it got nerfed. So they didn't really need many points increases or decreases, but they did get a few here and there, just like everybody in Craftworld Eldar. And to be honest with you, I think they're going to have a lot harder of time. In super competitive play, that is. I know the Ynnkarn is still really good, and obviously the Ynnari is still a really good faction, but I do think they're going to have a little bit more trouble when it comes to running a successful Alpha Strike list. I think they're going to have to find new ways to do it with Falcons or something like that, or they're just going to have to exit altogether. As for Craftworld Eldar, I see Craftworld Eldar being, well, honestly, more or less exactly the same, except with the fact that now we can use Fire and Fade every turn, so you're going to see the return of some units like, Warwalkers and Fire Prisms are going to be a little bit more prevalent. But, other than that, I don't think much changes, Not enough, in my opinion, got buffed in order to make any significant changes. I'm not going to consider Guardians. I'm not going to consider, units that, like Wraith units, like for example, in competitive lists. Even though I think that some lists do very well with certain Wraith units, like I think Wraith Guard are very good because they do a lot of damage and they're a pretty durable unit to return fire. So yes, they probably will still die, but it'll take your opponent a little bit more investment to actually kill them. However, I have to say, Fire Dragons just seem better to me, especially, because they can just honestly battle focus behind some terrain and not even be shot at all. So, I think overall, we're going to kind of see the same thing from Craftworld Eldar. I don't think any significant changes were made in the way that we play, and there's no incentivizing other play styles with the nerfs and buffs that we received, so we're probably just going to see more of the same. Some more Shroud Runners, a little bit less Swooping Hawks, stuff like that. And as far as the secondary objectives, I heard nothing really changed there except that we lost Hidden Path, which really, again, that really kind of sucks because Hidden Path was a cool objective. And to be honest with you, it looks like a lot of other factions got really good secondary objectives, and if Eldar have the same objectives, I'm sorry guys, we're stuck with the same terrible objectives. I hate to say it, but most of the Eldar secondary objectives just aren't really that great. Let's be honest. They're just not really that great for what we can bring to the table. But anyway, I'm going to cover that in a separate video, but this is going to be it for today's video. Peace out, you guys. Leave a comment in the comment section about what you think about the changes and whether you think it's good for the faction or not. I know that some people have differing opinions on this. I, for one, think that, to be honest with you guys, it's a little bit disappointing. I think the faction is more or less in the same place that it was. I think a couple of units will switch around here and there, but it won't affect, highly competitive tournament win rates or anything like that. I have a sinking feeling also that we are going to be outgunned on the secondary objective front because, to be honest with you, from what I've heard, they're exactly the same. I think there's no changes. In fact, we actually lost one of the better secondary objectives that we had, which was the hidden path. So that kind of sucks. But, I had a conversation with one of my Webway buddies, and he was actually saying that he's rather optimistic because of the changes to the detachments. He thinks that Eldar are going to be in a lot stronger place in general, and the nerfs probably won't hit as hard as a lot of people think. And he's also excited to use things like Wind Rider jet bikes again because of the lack of Armor of Contempt. And of course, he means the Shirkin variants, not the Scatter variant, of course. So, let me know what you guys think. I'd love to hear your comments, and there's going to be a good amount of content coming within the next week. I aim to make a couple more videos. The next video I want to do is on Wraith Knights, actually, and the viability of Wraith Knight armies in semi-competitive play. Your local game shop kind of games and stuff like that with friends. I think Wraith Knights are actually much better now. Even though they didn't get a points decrease or anything like that, the fact that they can take Craftworld traits is really cool. So, anyway, peace out, you guys. I'll see you guys later. And as always, thanks for stopping in. I'll see you guys next time.